My wife's new boyfriend seemed perfect until I found my 5-year-old son hiding under his bed with bite marks on his arms. I called the police that night and destroyed their lives forever. 2 years later, they're both in prison, and my son finally sleeps through the night. My name is David Parker, 34, sales manager from Portland. And until that November evening, when I found Tommy cowering in terror, I thought the biggest challenge of my divorce was splitting custody fairly. My ex-wife Rachel had been dating Marcus Webb for 6 months, and he'd seemed like a decent guy during our brief interactions at pickup and drop-off. Professional, polite, good with kids, according to Rachel. When I knocked on her door that Tuesday to collect Tommy for my custody weekend, Marcus answered looking flustered. "Rachel's running late at work," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Tommy's upstairs getting his things." Something felt off, but I couldn't pinpoint what. I climbed the stairs calling Tommy's name, expecting to find him packing his overnight bag. Instead, I found his room empty, his clothes scattered across the floor. That's when I heard the quiet whimpering coming from under his bed. What I discovered when I looked underneath would haunt my nightmares for months and fuel a rage that would drive me to dismantle Marcus Webb's life piece by piece. I didn't yell, I didn't confront Marcus immediately. I simply helped Tommy out from under the bed, noting the fresh bite marks on his small arms, the finger-shaped bruises on his wrists, the terror in his eyes when he saw me. "Daddy," he whispered, clinging to me. I was being quiet like he said. My hands shook as I examined the injuries, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't accidental. These weren't playground wounds. Someone had deliberately hurt my child, and that someone was downstairs acting like nothing had happened. I wrapped Tommy in his blanket, carried him to my car, and drove straight to the emergency room. "We need to document everything," I told the triage nurse, my voice steady despite my racing heart. As doctors photographed Tommy's injuries and social workers asked gentle questions, my phone buzzed with texts from Rachel. "Where are you? Marcus said you just took Tommy without saying anything." I didn't respond. I was too busy planning how to make sure my son was never alone with Marcus Webb again. What Marcus didn't realize was that I'd been a child of abuse myself. I knew the signs, knew the patterns, and most importantly, I knew exactly how to document everything for the authorities who would soon be very interested in his activities. Rachel and I had divorced 8 months earlier after a marriage that had slowly crumbled under the weight of different life goals and constant arguing. The divorce itself had been relatively civil ever. We'd agreed on joint custody, shared expenses, and what we thought were Tommy's best interests. I had him every other weekend and Wednesday evenings, while Rachel maintained primary custody in the house we'd once shared. When Rachel started dating Marcus 6 months after our divorce was finalized, I'd been cautiously optimistic. She seemed happier, more stable, and Tommy needed to see his mother in healthy relationships. Marcus Webb was a 38-year-old construction manager who owned his own small company. From my limited interactions with him, he seemed responsible and mature. He was polite during custody exchanges, didn't try to insert himself into parenting decisions, and according to Rachel, Tommy liked him. They'd moved in together just 2 months ago, which had initially caused some tension between Rachel and me about stability and introducing new partners too quickly. But Tommy had seemed to adjust well, talking excitedly about Marcus teaching him to throw a football and helping him with Lego projects. Looking back, I realized how carefully Marcus had cultivated that positive image, how deliberately he'd won over both Rachel and me before revealing his true nature. The warning signs had been subtle but consistent over the past month. Tommy had become increasingly reluctant to go back to his mother's house after our visits, always finding excuses to delay the return trip. He'd started having nightmares again after months of sleeping peacefully, and his normally sunny disposition had dimmed into quiet anxiety. When I'd ask about school or activities, he'd give short answers and change the subject quickly. Rachel had attributed these changes to normal adjustment stress from their new living situation, and I'd wanted to believe her. 2 weeks before I found him under the bed, Tommy had asked me an odd question during one of our Wednesday evening visits. "Daddy, what happens if someone hurts you but says it's just playing?" I'd given him the standard stranger danger talk, but now I realized he'd been trying to tell me something specific. 3 days before the discovery, I'd noticed small bruises on his legs when he was changing into pajamas, but he'd quickly explained them away as playground accidents. I should have pressed harder, should have trusted my instincts. Instead, I'd respected his explanation and tried not to be the overprotective divorced dad who saw problems everywhere. The escalating concerns became undeniable during Tommy's last stay at Rachel's house before I found him under the bed. He'd called me Tuesday afternoon, something he rarely did during Rachel's custody time, crying and asking when he could come to my house. When I'd asked to speak to Rachel, Marcus had taken the phone, explaining that she was at work and Tommy was just having a rough day adjusting to their new rules. "Growing pains," he'd said with a laugh that didn't sound right. "You know how kids can be dramatic." That evening, Rachel had called to apologize for Tommy's behavior, saying he'd been acting out lately, and they were implementing stricter discipline to help him adjust. She mentioned that Marcus had a lot of experience with kids from his previous relationships, and was helping her establish better boundaries. "He thinks I've been too lenient since the divorce," she'd said. "Maybe some structure will help Tommy feel more secure." The conversation had left me uneasy, but I'd convinced myself that every blended family went through adjustment periods. What I didn't realize was that Marcus was systematically isolating Tommy, testing boundaries, and grooming both Rachel and me to dismiss signs of abuse as normal behavioral issues. The moment of realization hit me like a physical blow when I found Tommy under that bed. The bite marks on his arms were fresh, the bruises on his wrists were finger-shaped, and the look of absolute terror in his 5-year-old eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't discipline gone too far or rough play that had gotten out of hand. This was deliberate, calculated abuse of a small child by someone who was supposed to protect him. As I held Tommy in the emergency room, listening to him whisper fragments of what Marcus had done to him, I felt something shift inside me. Not just anger, something colder, more focused, more dangerous. Marcus Webb had made the mistake of hurting my child, and he was about to discover that some fathers don't negotiate when it comes to their children's safety. The social worker who interviewed Tommy was experienced enough to recognize legitimate abuse when she saw it. The photographs of his injuries were clear and damning. The medical examination revealed evidence of ongoing physical trauma. This appears to be a pattern of abuse, she told me quietly. We'll need to involve law enforcement immediately. I nodded, already mentally preparing for the war I was about to wage. Marcus had counted on our silence, on Tommy being too young or too scared to speak up. He hadn't counted on a father who would burn down everything to protect his child. Within 2 hours of leaving the emergency room, I had called the police, filed a formal complaint, and arranged for Tommy to stay with my sister while the investigation began. I also called the best family law attorney in Portland, even though it was after business hours. This wasn't just about protecting Tommy anymore. This was about ensuring Marcus Webb never had access to any child ever again. When Rachel called that evening, frantic and demanding to know where Tommy was, I told her the truth. He was safe, and she needed to choose between her boyfriend and her son. You're overreacting, she insisted. Marcus would never hurt Tommy. There has to be an explanation. Her denial was heartbreaking but not unexpected. Abusers are experts at manipulation, at making their victims and those around them question reality. But I had photographs, medical records, and a traumatized child who had finally found the courage to speak. When the police arrived at Rachel's house that night to arrest Marcus, he played the confused innocent perfectly, claiming I was a vindictive ex-husband, making false accusations. He hadn't counted on the physical evidence, the medical documentation, or the fact that I'd been quietly building a case from the moment I found Tommy. The arrest was just the beginning. The next morning brought a new challenge when Rachel showed up at my apartment with her lawyer, demanding immediate return of Tommy and threatening to file kidnapping charges if I didn't comply. I let my attorney handle the conversation while I focused on what mattered, getting Tommy the help he needed and ensuring his safety. The emergency custody hearing was scheduled for that afternoon, and I was ready. I had medical records, police reports, photographs of Tommy's injuries, and a child psychologist's preliminary assessment confirming trauma consistent with abuse. Rachel's lawyer argued that I was using false allegations to gain custody advantage, but when the judge saw the evidence, her demeanor changed completely. This child will remain in his father's care pending a full investigation, she ruled. And I'm ordering a comprehensive psychological evaluation for the minor. Marcus Webb was being held without bail, charged with multiple counts of child abuse. But this was just the beginning of what would become a 2-year legal battle to ensure he could never hurt another child. As I held Tommy that night, helping him fall asleep in the safety of my home, I made a promise to myself and to him. Marcus Webb would face consequences for every moment of fear he'd caused my son. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about making sure this never happened to any other child. And I was just getting started. The investigation moved faster than I'd expected. Detective Sarah Martinez, who specialized in crimes against children, was thorough and relentless. Within 48 hours, she'd interviewed Tommy using specially trained child forensic specialists, documented every injury, begun building a comprehensive case against Marcus. But she also uncovered something that made my blood run cold. Tommy wasn't Marcus's first victim. We found evidence linking him to similar incidents in 2 other states. Detective Martinez told me during our meeting, there's a pattern here that goes back at least 5 years. She showed me files on 3 other children, all around Tommy's age, all from families where Marcus had been a trusted figure, a mother's boyfriend, a family friend, a temporary guardian. The abuse patterns were identical: gradual grooming, isolation of the child, escalating physical violence disguised as discipline. In each case, Marcus had disappeared before formal charges could be filed, moving to a new state and finding new victims. Your son might be the key to stopping this permanently, she explained. His testimony, combined with the evidence from the other cases, could put Marcus away for decades. I felt sick thinking about all the children who had suffered while Marcus refined his techniques. But I also felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about Tommy anymore, it was about every child Marcus had hurt, and every child he might hurt in the future. The family court proceedings were brutal, but necessary. Rachel's initial denial had evolved into grudging acceptance of the evidence, but she was fighting hard to minimize her own responsibility. Her lawyer painted her as another victim of Marcus's manipulation, which wasn't entirely wrong but ignored her failure to protect Tommy when warning signs emerged. During one particularly difficult hearing, Rachel broke down completely when the judge read excerpts from Tommy's forensic interview aloud. I didn't know, she sobbed. I would never have let him hurt Tommy if I'd known. The judge wasn't sympathetic. Mrs. Parker, multiple mandated reporters have testified that your son showed clear signs of abuse for weeks before his father discovered the situation. Your boyfriend was hurting your child in your home, and you failed to notice or act. The court ordered supervised visitation only for Rachel, pending completion of parenting classes and therapy to address her failure to protect. It was harsh but fair. Tommy needed to know that the adults in his life would prioritize his safety over everything else. My own custody was expanded to primary physical custody, with Rachel getting limited, supervised visits. Justice for Tommy meant not just punishing Marcus, but ensuring that every adult who'd failed to protect him faced consequences. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Marcus was building into something much larger than a simple child abuse prosecution. The FBI had become involved once the multi-state pattern emerged, and they discovered that Marcus had been using sophisticated methods to identify vulnerable families and insert himself into their lives. He'd targeted recently divorced mothers specifically, knowing they were often desperate for stability and support. He'd studied child psychology to better manipulate his victims and avoid detection. Most disturbingly, they'd found evidence that he'd been documenting his abuse, keeping trophies that could be used to blackmail his victims into silence. "This is one of the most calculated predators we've encountered," the federal prosecutor told me. "He's been running this operation for years, moving between states whenever he felt threatened." They'd also discovered a network of online contacts where Marcus had shared techniques for avoiding detection and finding new victims. The case was expanding beyond just Marcus to include other predators who'd been part of his network. Tommy's courage in speaking up had potentially saved dozens of other children from similar fates. The hardest part of the entire process was helping Tommy heal, while simultaneously preparing him to testify. The child psychologist, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, was gentle but direct about what Tommy would need to endure. "Testifying can be re-traumatizing," she explained, "but it can also be empowering for children to have their voices heard and see their abuser held accountable." We spent months in therapy, helping Tommy understand that what happened wasn't his fault, that speaking the truth was brave, and that Daddy would keep him safe no matter what. The courts arranged for Tommy to testify via closed-circuit television to avoid having to face Marcus directly, but he still had to recount in detail what Marcus had done to him. Watching my 5-year-old son describe his abuse in clinical terms to prosecutors was one of the hardest things I've ever endured. But Tommy was incredibly brave, answering every question honestly and completely. When the defense attorney tried to confuse him or suggest he'd misunderstood what happened, Tommy looked directly into the camera and said, "He hurt me on purpose. He said I deserved it." The jury's faces told me everything I needed to know about how Tommy's testimony had affected them. The trial itself lasted 3 weeks, and drew significant media attention due to the multi-state nature of Marcus's crimes and the involvement of federal authorities. I attended every day, wanting Marcus to see that Tommy had a father who would never stop fighting for him. Marcus maintained his innocence throughout, even as overwhelming evidence mounted against him. His defense strategy was to claim that all his victims were lying, that their parents had coached them to make false allegations. But the evidence was too comprehensive: medical records, photographs, forensic interviews, testimony from other victims, digital evidence of his predatory network. When one of his previous victims, now a teenager, took the stand to describe abuse that had occurred years earlier, the similarities to Tommy's experience were unmistakable. Marcus's pattern was so consistent that it demolished any claim of coincidence or false accusation. The prosecution painted a picture of a calculated predator who had spent years perfecting his techniques for finding, grooming, and abusing vulnerable children. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: multiple counts of child abuse, sexual exploitation of minors, production of child abuse material, and federal charges related to his interstate criminal enterprise. The sentencing hearing was where I finally got to speak directly about the impact of Marcus's crimes on my family. I'd prepared a victim impact statement that detailed not just Tommy's physical injuries, but the psychological trauma, the nightmares, the regression in his development, the therapy he'd need for years to come. "Marcus Webb didn't just hurt my son," I told the court. "He shattered my child's sense of safety in the world. He turned my home, our family structure, into something Tommy feared instead of somewhere he felt protected. The ripple effects of his actions will last for years." I also spoke about the other victims, the children whose voices hadn't been heard until Tommy's courage opened the door for them to seek justice. When I finished, the judge turned to Marcus, who had shown no remorse throughout the entire process. "Webb, you are a predator who specifically targeted the most vulnerable members of our society. You caused immeasurable harm to children who trusted you, and you did so with calculation and deliberation." The sentences were consecutive, not concurrent: 25 years federal time for the interstate trafficking charges, plus 15 years state time for the abuse charges. With no possibility of parole on the federal charges, Marcus would be in prison until he was in his 70s, if he lived that long. 2 years after that terrible night, when I found Tommy under his bed, our lives had found a new normal built around healing and safety. Tommy was thriving in therapy and had returned to being the happy, curious child he'd been before Marcus entered our lives. The nightmares had stopped, his appetite had returned, and he was sleeping through the night in his own bed without fear. He still saw Dr. Walsh monthly, but more for maintenance than crisis intervention. Rachel had completed her court-ordered programs, and was working hard to rebuild her relationship with Tommy, though it would never return to what it had been before. She'd had to accept that her failure to protect him had consequences, and that rebuilding trust would take years. Her supervised visits had gradually expanded to unsupervised time, but Tommy would always live primarily with me. She'd also become an advocate for other parents, speaking at training sessions about how predators manipulate families and what warning signs to watch for. Her guilt had transformed into purpose, which was probably the best outcome we could hope for, given the circumstances. The civil lawsuit against Marcus had resulted in a substantial settlement that would fund Tommy's therapy and college education, though no amount of money could undo the trauma he'd experienced. The broader impact of our case continued to ripple outward in ways I'd never expected. The FBI task force that had grown out of Marcus's arrest had identified and prosecuted 17 other predators in his network, resulting in the rescue of over 30 children from ongoing abuse situations. Tommy's courage in speaking up had literally saved other children's lives. Detective Martinez stayed in touch, updating me when their investigation led to new arrests. "Your son's willingness to testify opened floodgates," she told me during one of our conversations. Other victims found the courage to come forward because they saw that someone believed Tommy and that there were real consequences for their abusers. The case had also led to policy changes in how Child Protective Services investigated abuse allegations and how family courts handled custody cases involving domestic violence. Tommy's story had become part of training materials for social workers, police officers, and family court judges. In some small way, his suffering had been transformed into protection for other children. On Tommy's 8th birthday, as we celebrated at home with just family, he asked me a question that showed how much he'd healed. "Daddy, do you think I helped other kids by telling the truth about Marcus?" I hugged him tight and told him yes, that his bravery had made the world safer for lots of other children. He smiled and returned to playing with his new Legos, the weight of his trauma no longer defining him. That night, as I tucked him into bed in the house where he felt completely safe, Tommy slept peacefully through the night, just like he had every night for the past year. Marcus Webb was in a federal penitentiary, where he would remain for the rest of his natural life. Rachel was slowly rebuilding her relationship with our son based on honesty and accountability. And Tommy was free to be a normal kid again, protected by adults who had learned never to ignore their instincts when his safety was at stake. Sometimes the system works exactly as it should, and sometimes a father's love is indeed the most powerful force in the world.